feel about Mayor Bowser's level of cooperation and her choosing to advocate for DC's statehood right now? And
well, the statehood, let me do that one. Okay. Statehood is ridiculous. We want to straighten the place out. Statehood's ridiculous. It's unacceptable. It's the Democrats want it because the Democrats have, about 95% in this little area. Even I didn't get it very much. They want that. They want to pick up 2 senators, and it's not going to happen.
For the nearly 700,000 people who call D.C. home, this is not just a political moment. It is a reminder of a reality that has existed since the beginning of this city, founded in 1790. The nation's capital, one of the most economically powerful cities in the world, does not even have control over its own finances. D.C. generates more tax revenue per capita than almost every state in the country. Its private sector is one of the strongest in the nation. It funds its own schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and public safety, everything that a state government would handle. However, every single year, members of Congress who were never elected by D.C. residents have the power to approve, reject, or completely rewrite the city's budget. For many years after the establishment of D.C., the city has been in direct control of the federal government. For over a century, residents have had no voting rights, no representation, and no say how their city is run or how their money is spent. In 1973, however, Congress passed the D.C. Home Rule Act, giving the city an elected mayor and council for the first time. But Congress kept something critical. They remained the power to approve, modify, or reject D.C.'s entire budget annually. But budget control was not the only power Congress had kept. Under the Home Rule Act, Congress retained the authority to review and overturn any law passed by D.C.'s local government. This means that even when D.C.'s elected mayor and council pass legislation reflecting the will of D.C. residents, Congress can simply strike it down. More than 50 years later, that power is still being used, and D.C.'s economy is paying the price. To better understand what D.C.'s lack of fiscal autonomy really means for the people and business owners in D.C., I spoke with 3 people who experienced its consequences firsthand. The first person I interviewed was Carlos Ventura, the proud owner of La Plaza in Washington, D.C., up in Capitol Hill, and he speaks on the effects that federal control has had on his business and where he sees his business in the future. The second person I interviewed was Miss Reed, who is the DC's Deputy City Administrator and Budget Director. She is basically the person responsible for actually building DC's annual budget and having to navigate through congressional oversight from the city's government. And the last person I interviewed was Kevin Donahue, DC City Administrator. He is the number 2 official in DC's entire government behind Mayor Bowser, and he is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the entire city, along with looking over the budget and making sure that it upholds the DC residents. Together, their perspectives paint a picture of a city that is economically capable, fiscally responsible, and ready for full autonomy, but only being held back by a system that was not designed with the residents of the city in mind.
I think recently, I have realized a large increase in prices. Things are getting more expensive. Things are getting more expensive. Not only is product more expensive for us to buy, but also for customers to go out and buy their own stuff. So obviously, they're not going to be as motivated to spend extra money at a restaurant. And on top of everything, we had to raise prices. So all that from the very beginning, before anything like changes, before wages increase, all that at the very beginning, it's very hard because we lose business until things get moving again. Significantly, very, very significantly. We're looking at maybe, I think this government shutdown, I saw a decrease about 82% in sales. Um, when the government shutdown happened, because our customers are politicians, a lot of them are politicians. We're right on Capitol Hill. They're great people, very great people, very supportive people. They've helped in tough times, but you know what I mean. They're put in a position when now they're in a tough time, and we can't expect them to come and support us, obviously, until they get through their own tough times. But it definitely impacts us. Living in DC and a government shutdown comes with heavy, heavy, heavy impact. I do think that if we were to become a state, we'll have completely different funding, and we'll be able to reevaluate the DC tax code. I know for businesses, at least I gotta say, I pay crazy amount of taxes.
Yeah.
Crazy amount of taxes. Always on top of it, but it's insane. Sometimes it really makes me think, work so hard, I work very hard, and I'm giving a lot for of that to the government when sometimes it feels like the government isn't on my side.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, for sure, I really do think that could improve if we were to become the states, have different funding, maybe even more funding.
It's tough. We spend a lot of time building our budget, and we do that with a lot of input from our residents, from advocates, from businesses, from our agencies. And so a lot of hard work goes into putting that together and making sure we're reflecting where the mayor thinks we need to go in terms of the direction for the city, and making sure our residents, our businesses, and our workers are taken care of. So to have it then go to Congress and have them weigh in without having that sort of same engagement with DC is very frustrating. They're making decisions usually in a policy vacuum without consideration for what the residents who elected the mayor and the council, who are the ones who ultimately develop and pass the budget, were elected to do.
Mm.
It depends on the year. There are years where we haven't seen a lot of federal interference, and then there are years like last year where it was significant. So when Congress inexplicably left out this provision we had for years that allowed us to continue funding our budget at our appropriated levels. Last year, halfway through the year, they decided to not include it, which meant we had to immediately cut $1 billion from our local funds budget as we were 6 months into the fiscal year. Now, we ended up working very, very hard and finding ways to minimize impact through a couple different legislative vehicles that we had available to us. But that is a great example of, that was all of my time for many, many months, and was ultimately unnecessary. This was money that was local money collected by DC residents. It was not something Congress was the federal government was gonna kind of get back. This is local money. So it seemed to be punishing DC for no good reason. And that kind of funding, so our local funds budget is roughly $13 billion. So that would be like a 23%, increase, or 20% increase in our local budget. That would be huge. If you think about the schools alone, schools budgets, and actually I have this number in front of me. Schools and Health and Human Services are our two largest expenses. And for DC public schools and for public charter schools, the total budget for the upcoming fiscal year is going to be about 2.9 billion. So you can think about how you would be able to better resource really all of government. You'd be able to probably add some money to schools, but also to cover the cost of healthcare, which is our other largest expense here in the city. We have about, I think it's 4 in 10 DC residents are on our Medicaid program. And those costs grow every single year. And there's needs, all across the board. You could also potentially turn some of that into tax relief for DC residents through targeted tax reductions, aimed at those folks that need it most, or businesses.
Yeah.
There's always been the threat of congressional intervention. Congress has always had the power to intervene on DC, but historically, they rarely did it. So it was something that, as the city would develop budgets, you'd keep in the back of your head, but you wouldn't change what you're doing necessarily. In the Home Rule Act and the subsequent laws that Congress passed pertaining to DC, there's what I call back doors into reasserting control of DC.
Mm-hmm.
there was nervousness at the time in the 70s for giving DC any kind of autonomy. So the back doors were designed to allow Congress or the White House to intervene on DC again. And that's why for a long time, these powers, for the most part, have existed for a long time, but they've not been used often. More recently, though, Congress is more active in getting involved. About a year ago, they passed a continuing resolution to keep the federal government open. But in doing that, they held DC to spending limits of our prior year. So even though we were collecting money this year, more money than we collected last year, we had an artificial cap on how much we could spend. And this happened with really just about 6 months left in the fiscal year. And it caused us to have to make sudden changes to programs, suddenly stop hiring, suddenly stop issuing contracts and grants. And that was done without warning. So we're trying to shift our economy to not have to rely so much on the federal government. And that the taxes that we cannot collect, that other cities can and do collect, make that transition a lot harder. So that transition includes it's more difficult for us to fund what to me is our big three, which is homeless services, schools, and healthcare represent about 60 to 70% of every dollar of all the money we spend. So when we go through this transition economically, being able to not tap into revenue that other cities can means it's going to be more difficult in those areas that are really important. Yeah, any business, the most important thing for any business anywhere is certainty. So if you're making an investment, you have to rely upon some kind of stability that what you assume will be the policies of wherever you're locating will remain the policies. And it's really unsettling if suddenly, things change. So the challenge with Congress being involved is that it's harder for us to promise certainty because the mayor can propose a law, the DC Council can pass a law, but there's this other body that has to review our laws. It creates instability and uncertainty. In fact, when any city and state takes a loan out, their interest rate they pay is based on a rating that credit agencies give. So there's 3 credit agencies. They're based in New York City, and they basically will assess how risky an investment a city or state is. And we've always had very high ratings, meaning that in a good way, that means we have lower interest rates. We recently had our credit rating reduced. So we now have worse interest rates. And it didn't relate to DC doing anything wrong. It really was purely based on the potential instability that credit agencies see in the fact that we don't have autonomy. And now we have a more active Congress. And that brings uncertainty, and uncertainty brings risk, and risk is bad for economic development. Our restaurant industry is very important to DC, and we know that it is thriving in Maryland and Virginia, and it is shrinking in DC. Even though it's the same market, like if you live in DC, you can go to Virginia or Maryland to eat, vice versa. But we know it's shrinking in DC. And that's because our tax environment and our regulatory environment is more challenging. And what we'd like to do is make it easier for businesses to be able to hire people, stay in DC, and that requires giving them often tax breaks for making investments. So when Congress gets involved in our affairs and they prevent us from bringing revenue in, that really limits our ability to keep that restaurant in DC. Because that restaurant would want us to cut their fees. DC's has rules around the labor costs, that the cost of labor in DC is 3 times what it is in Maryland and Virginia. So restaurants' costs are a lot higher. So someone can move to Maryland or Virginia and see all their costs go down almost right away. And that's troubling. Immediately, and let me tell you this, if we were like any other place, the most immediate effect from a revenue standpoint is that if almost anywhere else in the country, if you work in one jurisdiction,
Mhm.
one state, and you commute to a different state, your income tax is based on where you worked. So if you're coming to DC, it's like if you come to New York City and you earn money in New York City, then you go home to New Jersey, your income taxes are New York income taxes because that's where you earned your income. In DC, it's because of our congressional involvement, it's not. So if you live in Virginia, you come to DC to earn your income, Virginia gets your income taxes. And that's not fair because no one else has to do that. That alone, we wouldn't have to raise a single tax. We wouldn't even have to put tolls on any bridges. That alone would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars into DC. And what we'd invest in is we know, DC's budget over the past about 12 years has almost doubled in size. And about 15% of that doubling came from raising taxes.
Mm.
But 85%, almost all of it, came from not raising any taxes. It just came from businesses and people who are in DC doing better. And so that's why when we look at investments, we look at three questions that we think are what makes our economy grow, which is how do we keep families here who have choices to leave and attract new people and families to DC? So how do we grow our population? How do we keep jobs in DC that may go out of business or flee to the suburbs? And how do we keep visitors coming to DC and, enjoying everything we have to offer and spending money here, particularly visitors from out of state, out of the country? And if we do those three things well, our economy grows and we can have revenue to make investments without raising any taxes. So what I would do with the money we get if we had autonomy is we would invest in programs that keep people here and attract residents, that make it easier to keep a business in DC, so they're hiring more in DC, and attract people to keep visiting here and spending their money in DC. And that's those three things are what makes our economy grow. And that's how we then use that money to fund schools and healthcare and human services and all the good things that people want for the city.
DC is not a city that is struggling to find its footing. It is a city that has already proven itself. It maintains balanced budgets. It funds its own schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. It collects more tax revenue per capita than almost every state in the country. It has done all of this while operating with one hand tied behind its back. The question was never whether DC could handle fiscal autonomy. The data has already answered that question. The real question is how much longer will 700,000 American citizens be asked to pay full federal taxes, serve in the military, and fund a government that gives them no seat at the table and no control over their own city. Every year that DC goes without fiscal autonomy is another year of billions of dollars that have left the table. Another year of businesses choosing Virginia or Maryland over DC. Another year of schools and housing programs underfunded, not because the money isn't there, but because the wrong people are controlling it. DC does not need Congress to save it. It needs Congress to move out of the way. The residents of this city have waited long enough. Their economy has waited long enough. And if the story of DC has taught us anything, it is that this city has always found a way to come back. Imagine what it could do when it has full power over its own finances.